Deep Sea Embers Chapter 61 to 70. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Chapter 61 Inches Unstable Navigation. Duncan thought he spent the entire night exploring the ship, but upon looking up at the darkness of the night, it appears he and the doll had only spent a few hours. Nevertheless, the impression it left on his mind was enough to last. What exactly is that thing behind the door? Eventually, the two had come before the captain's room. Neither had spoken much during the journey. Alice remains focused on what she's going to make in the kitchen, while Duncan's sight had landed on the stuff around the deck. According to his memory, the makeup here was practically the same as the design down in the lowest level, long and connected from one end to the other. Even so, he got this aching suspicion that he was missing something, like there was another passage or room hidden inside that dilapidated cabin that he was not aware of. Does the goat head know about that door? Does it know where it leads? Should I ask it myself? When Duncan finally reached to open the door, he was still lost in thought when Alice's voice called out to the goat head. The wooded figurine was still sitting quietly on the mapping table like usual, giving no sign of ever hanging. Mr. Goathead, I went to the bilge with the captain. This ship is so incredible underneath. The bottom cabin is torn apart, and there's a strange door at the end. That did it. Instead of trying to start the topic on his own, the doll had done the nice act of doing it on his stead. Trying to keep himself from making a sound, the ghost captain pretended to pack his things and listened to the conversation in the background. Oh, Miss Alice, I knew you would be surprised. Do you understand how great the Vanished is as a ship? It can sail across different dimensions at the same time without being a detriment to our safety. Adds by PubFuture. Duncan's heart suddenly jerked at the information. It's as he suspected, the ship was indeed sailing across multiple dimensions and not bound to this plane of existence. At the same time, his mind was also thinking quickly. Since Alice is full of curiosity about the lower half of the Vanished, she's going to keep asking for more information. Since I'm too intimidating for her to direct those questions, the only obvious choice is the goat head. But if I stay here and listen, it will get awkward and weird. On top of that, I risked getting thrown the ball if the wooded figurine shifts her questions over to me. At that point, I won't be able to answer Alice's question. No vel b in c ohm. By then, the ghost captain has hatched a plan. With a straight face, he casually said, "You two talk, I'm going out for a walk." Goat head, Alice is already a member of the ship. As long as the subject is not too sensitive, you can tell her anything. Alice smiled cheerfully as soon as she heard this, and the goat head didn't object either and immediately agreed. Of course, Captain, your loyal first mate will always welcome a new member. Done with that, Duncan pushed the door open and left the captain's room. But the next second he did so, the sneaky bastard concentrated his mind again and connected with the Vanished at a spiritual level. Through this, he could spy on the pair without the chance of being caught. As he focused, the vague perception became clearer and clearer until he saw Alice sitting on a stool across from the talking goat head. Apparently, the girl had forgotten how scared she was behaving during the entire trip and even omitted the fact that she offered to make the captain's late-night snack. Naturally, the man himself didn't care at all for the latter part. Meanwhile, the dove had flown herself up to the nearest mast while the owner did the horrendous act of eavesdropping. The bird had enough insight to act as a scout in case someone tried to sneak up on him like some naughty sidekick at a bank job. That door looked a little scary, and the captain wouldn't let me get close. Miss Doll had already glossed over the part about the lamp light being inverted and had started recounting the mysterious door. That's a given. Not only you, but even I can't touch that door. Don't make that face. I know I don't have any arms or legs. When I say touch, I mean it in another sense: interact, control, overseeing, you understand. That door is untouchable in every sense of the word. You didn't touch it, did you? Alice seemed to be startled by the extra severe tone from the goat head there. After a split second of hesitation, she jolted and cried, What is that door then?" This part had the direct effect of hooking Duncan's attention to the fullest. Yet, the goat head was dastardly enough to go silent for a good minute before replying, "You really didn't touch it?" Adds by PubFuture. "I didn't touch it," Alice replied hurriedly but then hesitated again before continuing, but the captain leaned over and looked inside. There was a slit open, so he stabbed his sword through the crack at something. As soon as the doll said that, Duncan could feel the entire ship shaking, followed by the low whimpering sound of the wind hitting the sails. There's also the creaking sound of the wooden ropes, but those were so messy that he didn't know which came from which. This was obviously coming from the goat head who was steering the Vanished. What did you say? There's a slit in the door. There's a crack. It didn't need the power of spying to know how shocked and astonished the goat head was. That's right. Alice seemed frightened by the strong words. The door was softly closed so it didn't fully lock, probably about a finger's wide at the side. And the captain peeked through the slit. And then what? He stabbed his sword. Did anything change about him at that time? Did he behave oddly or fall into a trance? No, replied Alice at once. The captain just had a serious face when he pulled his sword back out. Then he brought me back up here like something's troubling his mind. I offered to cook him something because of that. Oh right, I was about to go to the kitchen before. Forget the kitchen. Do you know what's behind that door? Ah, what's behind that door? Alice's tone still sounded stunned and a little dazed this time. She had never seen the goat head be so serious and urgent before, so it worried her a lot. Behind that door is subspace. Duncan, who was walking around the deck, froze on the spot. Behind that door is subspace. He was stunned beyond words, and rightfully so. So the lowest level of the ship is actually sailing in subspace. But based on what the goat head implied, this state of navigation isn't stable at all. In that case, is the slit at the door not supposed to be there? That it's supposed to be entirely closed? Or is it that something on the other side had forced it open? Duncan didn't think much about it at the time, but when he recalled how strange the resistance was from the door, a frightening idea hit him. Maybe, when I tried to close the door earlier, something on the other side was pulling against my hand and preventing it from being closed. Chapter 62 Inches Overlap. The shocking revelation that the Vanished had been navigating through subspace the entire time sent Duncan's mood into a peculiar low. He had always known that the Vanished was very strange and dangerous, but he had never imagined that the ship would be so abnormal. For example, his knowledge was most likely inferior to Nina's history teach on this subject, but he knew enough that subspace was the most dangerous thing in this world. It's enough to make those saints unable to sleep at night, make gods wary and afraid, and cause sailors to never dare shout the word, subspace, during their voyage. If everything is true, that dimly lit dilapidated cabin opposite of the door may be a seal set in place by the real Captain Duncan. Perhaps that area had already been eroded by subspace and cannot be restored. Duncan subconsciously looked down like he's able to see through the deck and onto that shattered cabin room. Right now, he no longer felt safe to be here, more like someone stepping on a powder keg that would explode at any moment. That little gap was the fuse, and once opened completely, that's when the bomb would blow. But after a brief moment of wild nervous tension, Duncan relaxed after recalling another piece of information the goat head revealed. According to the panicked look the wooded figurine showed after hearing Alice's story, Captain Duncan was supposed to behave weird and off like something terrible had happened. But nothing has happened so far, right? He's perfectly fine even after stabbing the sword through that slit in the door. Okay, maybe saying he's perfectly fine was a bit too positive. When he saw the illusion, Duncan did panic a little and thought about opening the door, but that's only a simple psychological change and not the influence of supernatural power affecting his mind. Duncan lowered his head and fixed his sight on his own hands, confirming again and again that nothing was wrong. Here, I am Duncan, captain of the Vanished. In another space-time, my name is Zhou Ming, an ordinary middle school teacher that's trapped in a single apartment room shrouded in the fog. Maybe, it's the goat head overreacting. It was only a crack in the door, not an entire open passage to the subspace. Ads by PubFuture. No longer swaying in his belief, Duncan raised his head and looked forward at the swaying masts and creaking ship that was battering against the waves. Right now, the controller had failed in its duty to steer the Vanished on the right course. NOBLB, in .C ohm. First mate, take charge of the rudder and control the sails properly. He snaps, ordering the goat head through his mental connection. CA, Captain. The voice of the goat head immediately rang out with a little panic. Ah, yes. Yes, Captain. Duncan did not say another word for he knew there's going to be more from the goat head. Captain, I just heard Miss Alice say the door at the bottom of the bilge opened a slit. Yes, replied Duncan softly, I checked. You did check, and Miss Alice said you confirmed the situation across the door. The goat head seemed to be weighing the pros and cons of asking, right now, do you feel, a little bit hazy? Across that door is subspace, I know, Duncan interrupted without waiting for the goat head to finish. Do you see me as if I'm mentally unwell? Quit beating around the bush. Of course, you don't look anything out of the ordinary. The goat head immediately said, maybe I was too nervous, after all, this kind of thing has never happened before. Since you drove the ship back, the barrier between the vanished and the subspace has been very stable. I didn't expect the situation to change, and this is by no means of me doubting you. Drive the ship back. From where? Duncan keenly caught the detail revealed by the goat head and quickly guessed a bit of the truth. Acting casually like he didn't care, as far as I can see, the crack in the door is still very stable, but I do not rule out the possibility of further expansion. I want to hear your opinion. It's already good news to know it's stable, Captain, said the goat head with a rather worried face. As for my suggestion, to tell you the truth, I don't know what to do. You left the door and you're the one who closed it with your own hands. You never told me what plans you had in mind, nor did you mention any changes. The bilge had always been handled by you personally. I see, Duncan said at once, you don't have any suggestions in this regard then. From the looks of it, the goat head doesn't know everything about the door down at the bilge either. He only knows it leads to the subspace, that it's dangerous once opened, and that the real Captain Duncan had left it behind. But where am I supposed to find a real Captain Duncan at this timing? Ads by PubFuture. Captain, the voice of the goat head sounded in his head again, what is your next arrangement? Arrangement? What arrangement? Am I supposed to head for land now? That will not happen with a reputation as bad as Captain Duncan's. The entire naval fleet will likely attack me when I show up on the coastal waters. Duncan rolled his eyes and looked helplessly up at the sky. Meanwhile, the dove had flown down from the mast and landed on his shoulders. Making a cheery chirp, this is a trap. Abandon the ship and escape. Escape. Run to where? Duncan said subconsciously but then quickly realized something. Wait, can you hear me talking to the goat head? He had been talking to the goat head through the spiritual connection of the ship, so how did this bird follow up with such appropriate words? The dove flapped her wings and looked down at its toes. Quit bitching bastard, I have my own understanding. At this moment, Duncan suddenly wanted to know what a dove soup would taste like. But he hadn't forgotten the goat head was still on the other line. Fixing his attention back on the subject, he promptly replied, you do your own thing and leave the door to me. Nothing has changed. Captain. The shaky attitude of the vanished gradually stabilized, and the sails were re-angled properly to continue the voyage. After coming up to the edge of the deck once he had ended the conversation, Duncan watched as the battering waves hit the ship's hull while they sailed. During this period, he reflected on the list of things he needed to do. Naturally, observing the bilge had just been added to the list, but just watching wouldn't change the situation. He needs more knowledge, more power, and perhaps, some help from the outside, maybe the city-state of planned. Nina will return from school tomorrow, and her, Uncle Duncan, will also need to be at the store when the time comes. Before that takes place, I must hurry and learn to fully control both bodies, otherwise I will end up having to switch back and forth with my main consciousness. Then there's the arrangement of transporting supplies over to the vanished from planned. That must also be tested further through I's ability. Then his eyes caught a glimpse of the world creation, reflecting on the waters. The world creation. Duncan was stunned for a second because a vague sense of familiarity just hit him. Raising his head upwards, he started to wonder. It's the same pale glowing wound as he observed the first time, but unlike in the past, he now got a new perspective. Those pale glows are not just a fog of light, but a myriad of overlapping and entangled streams of light, just like what he observed down at the shattered cabin of the vanished. Chapter 63 Inches Return to Port. Is the scene inside the bottom of the vanished the world creation? If the bottom of the ship is indeed the subspace, then is the world creation also part of the subspace? Or at least there is some connection between the two. But in the end, conjectures and speculation are only that, speculations. He had no evidence of this being true. The scar was too far away to make any experimental comparison, and even if he looked through a telescope, it wouldn't provide any more detail than what he knows now. Duncan spent a long time afterward just standing on the deck and letting the sea breeze blow against his face. The guy wanted to think about things, but more than that, he wanted to make sure everything was back in order. The news of him touching the door had unsettled the Vanished, and even now, there's a notable tremor happening across the ship and its inhabitants. Relax, this is nothing to worry about. Duncan tapped the nearest armrest and said in a calming voice. This time, he got clear feedback. The tension from the ship gradually subsided, and the ropes and sails had stopped shaking. From the looks of it, the ship has reaffirmed the captain remains the captain and not something else. Duncan eventually returned to the entrance of the captain's room after doing that, but instead of gently pulling the door open like usual, he used a bit of force and pushed it inward. As expected, the swirling gray fog was still there when he did this. I didn't stay on the ghost captain's shoulder then. Instead, she suddenly flapped her wings and flew to the nearest mast and cried out, "The road ahead is broken. The road ahead is broken." That earned a curious glance from the man himself, but in the end, he still stepped through and returned to the familiar bachelor apartment. Ads by PubFuture. Here, he's Joe Ming, the regular normal human of Earth. He still had on his familiar shirt, his familiar trouser, and a body far weaker than Captain Duncan's. Afterward, he examined the room for any differences. From what he could tell, everything was as he had left it. Not even the layer of dust had changed from some areas. Then Joe Ming mindfully turned around and faced the door behind himself. He wanted to test something. Assuming there's another person behind the door, Duncan took on the same position as the fake did behind that door down at the Vanished. Then leaving only a slit, he peered through, expecting a surprise somehow. This foolish act left Joe Ming's heart pounding. Even though it's unreasonable to assume anyone would be there or that a ghost captain would suddenly stab a pirate's sword through the crack. Nevertheless, the thought of this happening still brought exhilaration to the guy. Yet, there was only the billowing swirling black fog outside of his room. While Joe Ming became relieved that he didn't get stabbed, a strange sense of loss still plagued his heart. It's stupid of course to think this way. Who in their right mind would want to be stabbed? But he just couldn't help it. Shaking his head vigorously to shrug off the idiotic desire, he slowly got up and came to his desk. There's the scrap paper he scribbled on, the diary he used, and the computer screen in the middle that's still running despite the power being cut off. Nothing's changed. Joe Ming exhaled, but suddenly, his expression froze. There is a change. His gaze had fixed onto the corner of the desk where there's a lifelike model of the Vanished just sitting there. A stroke of lightning blasted Joe Ming in the head. Crumbling into the chair as he gasped for air from the shock, the man took several good minutes to get over this discovery. NOBLBJN.C. Once he's confirmed there was no mistake in his memory about this model ship never being here before, Joe Ming hastily snatched the item up with his hand and examined the darn thing. Ads by PubFuture. This realistic-looking ghost ship was only about half a foot long, and the thing didn't weigh any different from an ordinary model. However, the details were so refined that he could clearly see the ropes and buckets strewn across the deck. Compared with the real Vanished, the only difference was its size. Abruptly, Joe Ming appeared to have thought of something. Lifting the ship up to eye level, he carefully buckled open the door leading into the captain's room at the stern with his finger. He could see the miniature mapping table, but there was no wooded figurine of the goat head nor the sight of Alice. A surge of weirdness gripped Joe Ming at why he would think this. It's outrageous to think a model ship would have Alice inside it, but then again, wasn't the ship model's appearance outrageous in itself? The guy stayed in this state for a long while afterward to ponder the next step. He didn't know how the ship had appeared on his desk, but it was clear that the connection between his cordoned bachelor's apartment and the world across the door was more profound than he had imagined. The change may have occurred after he took the helm, or peered into subspace through the crack in the door. Regardless of the reason though, one thing's certain, he's still getting feedback from the other bodies across the door. This meant there was no threat to him yet from the change. Just like that, he sat in the chair for who knows how long until his eyes caught a glimpse of the shelf to the right. He had bought this cabinet years ago, but even until today, the guy never found the opportunity to fill it up aside from some decorative crystals. Figuring there was no better timing, Zhou Ming held the vanished up and carefully placed the model in one segment of the shelf. Done with that, he took 2 steps back and examined his achievements with a weird sense of satisfaction. How this thing came to be in his room was still a mystery, but during his days of entrapment, he's got a new hobby of decorating this empty shelf. A loud and melodious whistle broke the calm on the sea this morning. Vanna, who had arrived in the port early, immediately came to the observation deck to oversee the start of the operation. The authorities had emptied the place in advance, so there was no worry of innocent bystanders getting dragged into the mess. Instead, heavily armed policemen and clerics from the church were patrolling the dock with 12 of those spider steam walkers acting as blockades to the roads. Soon enough, the intended target had begun to approach the coastal waters. It's a large mechanical steamship, the White Oak. Chapter 64 Inches White Oak's encounter with Duncan. The White Oak has returned. After a long period of disconnection and deviation from course, the advanced steamship belonging to the Adventurers Association has finally returned to the city-state of Planned. Inquisitor Vanna didn't need to give further orders. As soon as the whistle from that vessel blew, the personnel on the dock immediately took action. The staff guiding the ship to dock had arrived and began to signal the White Oak with lights and flags, while the church's guardians went to activate the deep-sea relics that had been placed all over Pier Number 1 the night before. A large number of bronze boundary tablets, with the name of the storm goddess Jimana inscribed on the base, and sacred grease and spices were strewn along the floor to connect all the tablets together. This arrangement would effectively seal off the area and become a holy ground under the goddess's gaze. Farther away were the policemen sent by the city hall. These ordinary folks weren't capable of dealing with the supernatural, therefore, their main job was limited to blocking off the intersections with those steam spiders. Ordinary guns didn't have much effect in dealing with the dreadful and invisible curses, but blowing apart a physical monster that might jump off the White Oak was plenty good enough. Eventually, Vanna's gaze crossed the dock and fell upon the White Oak that had blown a second whistle after drawing close enough to assess the situation aboard. It doesn't look too bad, Inquisitor. The White Oak has carried out its instructions, and it seems that the ship is still controlled by humans. One of the priests standing next to Vanna murmurs in a slightly relieved tone. Things aren't certain yet. Many people affected by visions and anomalies will appear no different from ordinary people until they mutate. Vanna shook her head to dismiss the thought of success. Send out the second set of signals and have the inspection crew board it. I want all guns pointed at the ship in case anything changes. Do not hesitate to open fire if it does. The order from was quickly conveyed to those beneath, and since the White Oak's communications device had been damaged, the people on shore could only communicate with the ship using lights and flags. After a complex set of lights and banners again, the bow of the White Oak lit up 3 lights, followed by the dropping of a rope ladder on its side. Seeing this, the speedboat from the dock was promptly driven over using a steam mechanism. The inspection team had been comprised entirely of guardians from the church, including 8 combatants and a priest commander who lit the incense aboard to ward off evil while also sprinkling spiced grease around the waters. As long as the commander remains well and continues to chant the holy name of the storm goddess, no anomaly should be able to escape their findings. Supposedly anyway. After all this was done, the priests and guardians on the speedboat swiftly climbed the rope ladder with ease. This all fell into Van's eyes, who had remained on a wary lookout the entire time inside the watchtower. It was perilous to let a ship that had been lost at sea return home, especially when its objective was to transport anomalies across the ocean. So, first, it mustn't be allowed to dock and inspected by a team at a safe distance. But that's not enough to enable the crew to disembark though. Instead, the second round of inspection must be followed to ensure the vessel itself hasn't been mutated into something else entirely. This second step also allowed the team to perform a purification operation across the entire vessel to ensure nothing lurked in the darkness. Once done, everyone, including the inspection team, is to be kept on close observation by the church for several days to a week. This of course also included the White Oak since vessels are not excluded from corruption. Ads by PubFuture. Now, if any of these links were to go wrong though, the White Oak and its crew would likely be buried out at sea where the storm goddess's embrace awaits to receive their poor souls. This cold, even cruel law, does not come from anyone's malicious intent but the way of survival that human society has so far explored. Of course, There are also those city-states that are unwilling or fail to enforce these strict tangent rules. For that failure, their names are now concentrated in the first 2 volumes of the secondary school history textbooks, which are required for the final exam. Time passed minute by minute, and everyone awaiting the signal from the Guardian team aboard the ship was tense and uncomfortable. There could only be 2 signals from this, the first being an all was okay from the psychic link of the clergy sitting inside the port chapel, the other a detonation of nitroglycerin on the dinghy to sink the White Oak. A big ocean-going vessel like the White Oak wouldn't have survivors if it did get deeply polluted by subspace. So, destroying the vessel wouldn't bring guilt to those watching. As Vanna crossed her arms and gently tapped the metal arm where during this arduous wait, a sudden chime of the chapel bell caught everyone's attention, followed closely by 3 long whistles of the relief pipes on both sides of the bell tower. The priests in the church have received a secret message from the inspection team, and the church bells and whistles were the announcements that it's safe to dock the White Oak for a special situational report. This undoubtedly sent a wave of relief through Vanna's veins. There's no better news they could ask for. As for having a special situational report, the lady was not surprised at all. In fact, it would be strange that there wasn't after the ship bizarrely disappeared from the pre-planned route. More church guardians began to board the ship once the docking procedure had been completed. Vanna didn't dally around either and led a group of highly trained priests over. She swiftly jumped over the long springboard to step onto the deck, where a gray-haired, burly captain awaited her arrival. The old captain looked a little haggard, apparently having overworked himself in a state of high tension. However, after seeing the inquisitor of the church approaching, the old man immediately raised his spirit and took the initiative to greet the lady. "Hello, Captain Lawrence, I'm Inquisitor Vanna of the Deep Sea Church." Vanna did not like the redundant etiquette and chose to get straight to the point. Let's skip the formality. First of all, I want to apologize for the reception and hope you and your crew will understand the strict inspection demanded of the authorities and church. No vel b in .c ohm. Of course, Your Excellency, Lawrence nodded at once. He had wanted to say, Miss Inquisitor, due to the lady looking no older than his own daughter, but quickly changed the wording to a more respectful title. I had expected this, after all, we lost contact for so long. Ads by PubFuture. Vanna nodded. Tell me briefly what happened to the White Oak. I want to know how you lost contact with the authorities and how you reappeared on an unplanned route. And what about the good you are tasked with escorting, Anomaly 099? As soon as these words came out, the expression on Lawrence's face was suddenly full of frustration and nervousness. Sighing, he subconsciously glanced around before lowering his voice into a whisper. You may not believe me when I say this, but we met the legendary Vanished. In front of his own eyes, the stern and authoritative Lady Inquisitor suddenly got stiff like a stunned statue. Even the serious expression somehow appeared iced over like a frozen popsicle. Lawrence couldn't tell what that expression meant, but he got the inkling suspicion that this would have been how he looked when they crashed through the ghost ship. Inquisitor. The old captain asked cautiously, You. Captain Lawrence. Vanna jerked back to attention like she's awoken from a daze. Staring dead into the eyes of the old sailor, repeat that again. You may not believe me when I say it. I'm referring to the second half. We met the legendary Vanished. I believe you. This time it was Lawrence to be stunned. That. You may need to stay on the docks for a few more days, Captain, said Vanna with a serious face. This matter is very, very serious. You and your crew, hold on. You encountered the Vanished, yet all your members survived. The expression on the face of the lady suddenly got a bit ugly, like there was doubt and wariness in her eyes. This didn't go unnoticed by Captain Lawrence, who promptly explained the situation. Yes, my crews and I are fine, but the Vanished took away Anomaly 099. That is the doll in the coffin. I suspect the ghost ship came specifically for that puppet coffin. The Vanished stole Anomaly 099. Vanna frowned, then asked, What about after that? It just let you go. Yes. Lawrence also became nervous and vaguely realized something. Your Excellency, is lately the city. It doesn't hurt to tell you. After all, it seems that your contact may be more serious than ours now. Vanna sighed as she shot a grave look at the captain in front. Captain Lawrence, you may not be the only person who has dealt with the Vanished recently. Let's find a quiet place. I need to know more. Chapter 65 Inches Alice Guillotine. A temporary sanctuary was eventually set up for White Oak's captain after he disembarked. NOVELBJN.C. Ohm. The smell of incense wafted through the room that had been adorned with amulets depicting various storm runes. On top of this, priests had also set up bronze boundary tablets on all four corners to create a barrier. They also brought the Storm Code, a biblical book from the cathedral to the sanctuary. It's the eye for the defense against evil. After this was all done, Captain Lawrence entered the room with Inquisitor Vanna. "I hope you don't mind our arrangement here," Vanna said lightly, maintaining the conservatism and courtesy that a high-ranking priesthood should have, all for safety. "Of course, everything is for safety. What I lack most now is security." Captain Lawrence immediately nodded understandingly. After looking around the room at the sacred things, he felt slightly relieved and lost some of the fatigue over his head. "With all these things around, I believe any ordinary corruption would be destroyed the second they step inside." "That's most likely. Now, why don't we begin from the start? Here, you can tell me everything about the Vanished." Vanna nods in agreement and waves for the captain to begin. "Let's start from where you saw the ship." Captain Lawrence relaxed and began going over the tale of the terrible event. "It is like this." Captain Lawrence left nothing out in front of the Inquisitor lady. He even went into clear detail about what he had for breakfast that day and what time the sailors on the ship had eaten. Those of whom he couldn't remember or weren't aware of was also ordered by him to write inside the captain's log for this moment. An experienced captain knows, many anomalies are preceded by seemingly ordinary signs that individuals would disregard as the norm until it's too late. Therefore, the professional thing to do would be to review and write down everyone's experience to compare, and if the details didn't add up, that's how one would know where to look. Vanna listened carefully to the thrilling encounter until her brow furrowed up because the situation was more serious than she had imagined and more bizarre than she could ever believe. Ads by PubFuture. She had thought that Captain Lawrence's so-called encounter was just a face-to-face, or at best, a passing by the ghost ship from some distance. But instead, the captain described a direct head-on collision with the ghost ship and even nearly turned into an ethereal form themselves. The mere fact that they all came out alive was nothing but sheer luck. "Your Excellency." Seeing that Vanna hadn't responded for a long while, the old captain grew uncomfortable and waved at the lady to return to reality. "What is your opinion on the Vanished? Did that ship really attack us because of Anomaly 099? Vanna glanced at him. "Isn't that what you've always thought?" I've always thought so, but now I'm not so sure," Lawrence sighed, "especially since you just said that the ghost captain recently extended his power to the city-state of Planned. I always felt that things would not be so simple." "No one can guess what the ghost captain thinks." Vanna shook her head, "and all we can do now is conduct the most thorough inspection of the White Oak to prevent the ship from carrying any intrusions. You and your crew will also suffer some grievances for the next while since we cannot allow any of you to have contact with anyone outside of the church. This arrangement will continue until the investigation is over. This includes family visits." Captain Lawrence bowed his head in compliance. "Of course, I can understand." Then he paused before asking something else on his mind. "So, about the theft of Anomaly 099. Vanna knew what the captain was worried about. The eerie horror of the sea vision was a threat hanging over the heads of all civilization. Still, before considering these long-term and vast threats, the captain was foremost an ordinary folk who needed to support his family. In addition, he has lost Anomaly 099 from piracy. There's no way an average person like him could shoulder this burden. Rest assured, the matter will be explained by the church to the city-state authorities and the Adventurers Association," she said quietly. "The appearance of the Vanished is an undeniable force, and the loss of Anomaly 099 is not your responsibility. Even if it was a church ship responsible for escorting, the result might be the same." The expression on Captain Lawrence's face visibly relaxed. But there was still another word in Vanna's mind that she didn't say. In the final analysis, anomalies, in itself wandered on the edge of being sealed and out of control. As a result, plenty of city dwellers would lose their lives due to this reasoning. In the face of such a dynamic imbalance, no one could be certain of anything. Ads by PubFuture. In addition, Captain Lawrence suddenly grew hesitant before forcing him to ask, "I want to inquire, what is so special about the Anomaly 099? Speaking of this, he paused and then quickly added, "Of course, when I undertook the escort job, I had received a note with the information regarding how to seal 099 and the emergency disposal method, but I never got any information regarding its background and origin. You know it too. It is an anomaly within the 100 figures, the less normal folks like I know about it, the better. But 099 has already been abducted by the vanished. Therefore, according to regulations, it should be counted as completely losing control. So, that's fine. It's okay to tell you now, Vanna nodded before Captain Lawrence finished. Since Anomaly 099 is no longer within the control of civilization, the next step is to release the relevant information to the adventurers, association and ability users within the various city-states. You are a member of the former and the last to be in contact with 099. You are entitled to the information. Speaking of this, she contemplated for a while to sort through the information in her possession. Anomaly 099, the doll coffin. Its appearance is a gorgeous wooden box like that of a coffin with a sleeping doll inside. The doll has silver hair and wears a purple dress, and the body shape resembles that of ordinary humans. The anomaly was initially found in the cold sea of the north. The puppet's appearance inside the coffin is extremely close to that of Queen Rhaenora, who was beheaded and executed by the rebels half a century ago. However, there is no evidence of a real connection between the two. The anomaly does not have a tendency to think, has no consciousness, but is very likely to actively perceive the outside world and exert its influence outward. You should be aware of the sealing method for 099, so I won't repeat that part. As for the danger it poses, first of all, the puppet coffin tends to settle. Once it is stuck in a certain area long enough, it will regard the area as its territory. From then onward, it will be difficult to transfer 099 to other places while gradually expanding its influence to the surrounding area. The seal on it will also weaken sharply, becoming more to losing control. It's also a common feature for a considerable number of anomalies. It's the main reason we hired you to move 099. It's to prevent excessive growth. Secondly, in the event that the puppet coffin is out of control, all humanoid units, including elves, dwarves, orcs and the likes, will be targeted within a certain range of its surroundings. The specific criteria for targeting are not clear. All we know is that the victims will immediately lose control of their freedom of movement like a puppet pulled by a string. Without exception, they will unconsciously bow down in the direction of the coffin, just like someone worshipping a queen. Once this action is completed, the victim will be immediately beheaded. The decapitation cannot be avoided, cannot be protected, cannot be exempted, and there is no point in applying a blessing or wearing armor on the victim. The only condition for being selected is at the whim of the puppet. The victim will directly become decapitated after bowing. Only then will the puppet stay quiet for 4 to 6 hours. Afterward, it will look for the next target and repeat the cycle. Until now, no normal person has survived its selection. The puppet coffin also has the characteristics of moving on its own during the out-of-control state. It's extremely fast, extremely powerful, and will break free of capture in various unbelievable ways. On top of all that, the coffin itself is also extremely powerful. The longer it's on the loose, the further the damage it will cause. Of the several runaway events on record about the doll coffin, only one saint has ever survived the ordeal. However, that saint also happens to have the bloodline of the northern Frost City state. We cannot be certain it is the saint's strength that prevailed or that it is the puppet coffin's forgiveness characteristic acting up. Listening to the young inquisitor's calm and indifferent narration, Captain Lawrence felt his hair standing up little by little. His first thought was, the money of the city-state authorities is really not easy to earn. No wonder the reward for escorting Anomaly 099 is almost 5 times that of the escort of an ordinary anomaly. This kind of total disregard for defensive measures and only needs the puppet's attention on you is impossible to dodge. At the same time, the voice of Inquisitor Vanna voice rang again to interrupt his train of thought. For the puppet coffin's terrifying ability, the church gave it a special name when documenting Anomaly 099, which is named after the torture device used by the rebels to execute the Frost Queen half a century ago, Alice Guillotine. Chapter 66 Inches Good Morning on the Vanished. Alice, take care of your head. The beautiful morning on the Vanished began with the captain's angry roar on the deck. Duncan stood outside the captain's room, his finger pointing to the head of the doll hanging from a nearby beam. He's twitching in the eye as he watches the headless doll getting up in a panic to retrieve the hanging head. With a crisp click, Miss Doll reconnected her head back on and promptly trotted over. Hee hee. Don't hee hee me. What are you doing hanging your head above my door in the morning? Don't tell me you're acting as the scout. There's a dove for that. Duncan stared at this cursed doll, which unfortunately knocked a few years off the captain's lifespan. Seriously, who wouldn't be scared silly at having a decapitated head hanging outside their room in the morning? I washed my hair in the morning. Alice shrank her head down and replied meekly, my hair wasn't drying fast enough, so I wanted to hang it higher so it can catch some wind. Duncan. Alice peeks up after getting no response. Captain, are you angry? You are right. After holding his breath in, Duncan could only blurt this out while restraining the muscles in his cheeks. He had to admit, from the perspective of Alice's lifestyle, putting her head up in a higher place like the mast was indeed a good idea. Besides, other items on the ship were doing weird stuff, like taking a nap or the bucket rolling to the back for a suntan. Nothing was normal on this ship, and it's about time the man got a bigger heart. In this respect, Alice had adapted quite well to life on the ship. This would be called mingling, and if he had to put a word to it. Captain, you're not angry. Alice immediately laughs because she has a good grasp of the captain's temperament by this point. She's still in awe of the man, but she's no longer afraid of him like on the first day and even dares to bargain for benefits. Then, Captain, can I still hang my head? No, anywhere but outside the captain's room. Duncan shot a sideway glance at the doll. I don't want to wake up in the morning and find a crew member's head welcoming me at first light. Alice could only honestly bow her head. Oh, okay. Ads by PubFuture. Duncan still looked at her skeptically like he didn't believe it's not going to happen again. Captain. Alice grew a little timid by the attention. Why do you keep staring at me? I just suddenly thought of a question, Duncan said as he pondered. You're suffering from hair loss, right? So then, do you grow it back? Alice was stunned, her expression becoming that of a broken recorder. It took a long while until her eyes suddenly jerked to attention at the captain's implication. I didn't think about it at all. Captain, you. The last few words of her sentence were borderline crying. In the end, she couldn't actually bring herself to say it aloud because, Captain, are you a devil? Would surely warrant a knock on the head. On top of that, she didn't want the goat head to go on a nagging spree regarding this later. Duncan didn't care what Alice forced back down. Instead, his attention was on something else entirely. You see. Although you can walk and jump like a normal person, but your body is that of a real puppet doll. You don't eat or drink, and joints can fall off anytime. In this case, wouldn't your hair be a non-renewable resource? The more you wash, the faster you will become bald. Wouldn't combing also worsen the condition? Alice was about to really cry. Captain, why would you think of such a terrible thing? Duncan. Actually, I've always wanted to ask you this question after eating that bowl of fish head soup. Alice was so taken aback by the soup description that she openly sniffled to pull the snot back. But I cooked fish soup. Duncan puts on a front of truth and justice. Didn't you use the fish's head in the soup? Then why isn't it fish head soup? Alice. Captain is right. Just like that, the beautiful morning on the Vanished began with everyone's mutual recognition of reasonableness. Miss Doll left in a trance after the morning exchange. She seemed to suddenly have a lot on her plate about the future and what it foretold. Meanwhile, Duncan's mood was as giddy as it came because he had just pulled the most devilish prank on the ship. Of course, the guy also partook in his usual breakfast in the mapping room, the chopped cheese and spirit he brought from Planned, which weren't much but still delicious considering what's on the Vanished. Captain, what happened to Miss Alice? I noticed that she had absent-mindedly returned to her quarters and slammed the door twice on the way in. Is she preoccupied with something? The goat head asks after sensing the oddity with the doll. Ads by PubFuture. She's facing a major life challenge, and I don't think you'll have to worry about her fighting the items aboard the ship for a while. Duncan brought the wine glass up to his face and grinned mischievously, but I'm curious about one thing. Huh, what are you curious about? Does a cursed doll really become a bald doll once their hair falls out? Duncan begins an honest discussion with the wood figurine. Shouldn't a supernatural item have supernatural powers to ensure its maintenance? Unfortunately, I couldn't dive further into the topic with Alice when she ran away. Goat's head. The silence drew an intrigued look from Duncan. Why aren't you talking? After a period of being at a loss for words, the goat head finally lets loose. You are truly the most terrifying natural disaster on the boundless sea. Such a question is something I can never ask. Duncan shrugged and got up from behind the mapping table. I'm going to leave again, he said to the goat head and snapped his finger to summon a wisp of green flame. Immediately, the dove flew down from the shelf and landed on the man's shoulder. As usual, you are in charge of the helm while I'm away. Of course, Captain. As your most loyal first mate, I will not disappoint. The goat head agreed without hesitation and soundly pumped with energy. But Captain, you've been lately a bit keen on spirit walking. Is there something on land that interests you? NOVELBJN.C. Ohm. Duncan didn't respond immediately but paused to ensure he's got a good excuse. I recently discovered after a century of development, the world is more interesting than imagined. It won't expose him for lacking knowledge by going this route, and it gave him ample reasoning to explore the land side more often in the future. If necessary, the excuse could also be used as the reason for returning the vanished to civilization. Most importantly, the answer fits with the image of Captain Duncan, the infamous ghost captain and the biggest natural disaster on the boundless sea. The goat head didn't explode like the man expected but instead took the decision for granted. Oh, you're absolutely right, Captain. After all these years, those city-states should have come up with something to intrigue you. I can see why you would want to relieve your boredom. In this case, should the vanished be prepared? Which city-state are you planning to invade? Planned, Renza, or the one further north? Originally Duncan was still pleased to hear the support, but as the goat head went on and turned his excuse into a full-blown invasion plan, his heart instantly sank and pulled the brake. When did I say I want to invade a city-state? Something interesting has emerged. Wouldn't it be a shame to destroy it? Ah, right, my suggestion is too reckless. The goat head immediately changed his attitude about the whole thing. I thought you were going to drive the ship over there in the future. Of course, the idea must be voided now since there's no plan of that. In fact, this way is also very good. No matter what, those city-states do have some strength. Simply driving the ship over there is a bit risky. In the future, don't mention invading a city-state. Duncan looked at the goat head and added another layer of insurance. We have been derailed from the world for over a century, and now I want to regain control of the changes in civilized society, which may involve many long-term changes. Don't make superfluous plans until I have a clear order. As you command, Captain. Chapter 67 Inches New Contact. The goat head was a dangerous fellow, and Duncan knew it from the beginning, not only because it was an unknown anomaly but because it had been loyal to the real Captain Duncan and still plays and thinks according to the rules of old times to this day. From the perspective of the goat head, the city-states on land are meaningless, the mortals in the city-states are stupid and ridiculous, the weak city-state fleets are all food, and plundering and hunting them was the natural, everyday, objective of the vanished. Duncan didn't know how long it would take him to adjust the goat head's habits, but he knew the process had to be subtle, and it was the safest way to change himself and the ship. He took one last look at the goat head that was quietly waiting at the sailing table. Upon confirming that the other party had taken over the sails and rudder system of the vanished, he then pushed the door into his bedroom. This afternoon, Nina would return to the antique shop, and before that, he had to let the dove complete his test projects. Once the door to the captain's chamber was closed, the goat head quietly watched the direction of the departing captain. Only after an unknown amount of time did the wood statue sigh before softly muttering to itself, he really didn't get affected by subspace. Oh vanished, what did you fish up back then? Duncan had returned to the familiar dark tunnel with the shimmering strips of starlight. On one end was the vanished's connection, the other the antique shop inside planned. From how it looks, he no longer had to actively control his mind to be connected to both sides after practicing for so long. Even now, the man could remotely control the body inside the shop for simple daily activities. This was obviously a good thing. An antique shop owner who spends more than half the time sleeping in the store would obviously be suspicious. Even if merely standing at the doorway for a minute or two would dispel a lot of unnecessary attention. Instead of immediately teleporting his main consciousness to the city-state of planned, Duncan held out in the dark tunnel and carefully perceived the changes in the space before eventually shifting his sight to the side. In the vast darkness, I had transformed into her undead bony form that was sprinkling with green fire in her flight. However, he's more focused on the vague shadows hovering around the area of the bird. Among the shadows were the sun talisman previously brought to the vanished, a quaint and old short dagger, a piece of cheese, a round cannonball, and a hard salted, dried fish. Ads by PubFuture. These are test items that he prepared before he set out to further test I's ability of carrying items and the changes that might occur during the process. The short dagger was found in the cabin, once probably belonged to some sailor. It was a mindless ordinary item. The cheese was taken from the galley and had the property of not perishing, and the shells came from the ammunition depot, while the dried salted fish was one of the harvests from the last fishing venture. Actually, the fish hadn't been fully dried yet but was nevertheless hard as a rock after 2 days of bathing in the sun. Duncan stared at I, who was hovering around these shadows, and nodded slightly in approval. So this is how you carry the items. I flapped her wings and let out a light, sharp cry, sit firmly, sit firmly. Duncan smiled and gathered his spirit, ready to project the main consciousness forward. But at the moment of concentration, he suddenly saw a strange glimmer appear at the end of the stream that was pointing towards the city-state of planned. Duncan immediately stopped, looking in amazement at the light that flickered among the countless dim stars. The light seemed to be there, only to turn from dim to bright at the moment of his concentration. It's as if the star could sense his presence and answered his call. What is that thing? Duncan tried to lean towards the glimmer in doubt, and with just a thought, he had already crossed the vast darkness and shot towards the light. Only then did he understand this connection. It was similar to his body on the vanished and antique shop. This is another spare shell to be chosen. No, vel, b, in c, ohm. Duncan couldn't help but have such a conjecture in his mind, but he quickly shook his head to dismiss the idea. The shimmering star in front of him was far superior in scale to those points of light representing the body. Such a large light, it was not so much a shell to be chosen but rather a huge object that has established a connection with oneself. Without hesitation, he made up his mind and stretched out his hand to cautiously touch that star. In the next second, a huge and unfamiliar perception suddenly flooded into his mind. He couldn't see the things around him, but the sense of the sea breeze blowing against his body was quite evident. There was also the sound of people talking all around, but the noise was so muddled that he couldn't discern who was talking or what topic they discussing. It's similar to someone eavesdropping through a thick drapery. Ads by PubFuture. Duncan had a vague awareness he must be perceiving through some sort of behemoth structure. Otherwise, he wouldn't be having so much trouble making out the words. However, there's also the possibility of an outside force interfering with his connection. Regardless of what the answer was, the ghost captain caught enough of the words that it was a tense and solemn atmosphere on the other side. Eventually, he finally managed to make out one name that repeatedly came up, the White Oak. Taking his hand back from the light stream, Duncan watched the star that's showing a shadow of a ship in the tear with a look of surprise. The White Oak, the name seemed a little familiar, but I can't quite remember when I heard it. Duncan thought hard to recall the name. Finally, through much effort and rummaging, he understood it must be the same ship that had collided with the vanished from before. Immediately afterward, he also remembered the newspaper he had bought in the city-state of Planned. At that time, a section of the paper had mentioned the incident about that ocean-going ship being missing for several days but would soon make port. For a while, Duncan didn't know what to make of this and fell into a daze because this was the White Oak, the ship responsible for escorting Anomaly 099. The old captain who had tried to talk to me seems to have finally reached Planned, and apparently the ship has made a connection with me. Could it be that the connection was established after the original, Spirit World ship collision accident? Because the flames of the vanished at that time extended to the White Oak. Duncan had a faint conjecture in his mind, speculating on the various attributes of his ghost flame while also wondering if his connection to the steamship could be of any use. After drifting aboard vanished for so long, he valued every connection between himself and the civilized world. Now it seems that although the White Oak has docked, it was still in a certain state of blockade and surveillance. As for those nervous people humming around to make so much noise, they should be the professionals of the city-state who specialize in dealing with extraordinary visions. Clearly, a ship that had been lost at sea was dangerous for the people of the city-state, and the experience of close contact with the vanished may also be a major pending matter. Duncan had enough awareness to know the sort of reputation his ghost ship held. After thinking about it for a while, Duncan cautiously stepped back and did not continue to touch the light in front of him. As the number one boss on the Boundless Sea, he did not intend to deal with the city-state's protectors without knowing the details of the power users in their roster. Also, keeping the white oak as an anchor for future use was better than exposing it now and being destroyed. At that time, maybe he could finally talk to the old captain calmly instead of that messy brief encounter smothered by the wind. Chapter 68 Inches Reliable Dove Express. A cool sea breeze suddenly blew across the deck, causing Captain Lawrence, who had just walked outside, to rub his arm subconsciously. He didn't know if the feeling of goosebumps was due to the cool sea breeze or what the young inquisitor had told him. Anomaly 099, the puppet coffin, after losing control, not only has the ability to move and the tendency to get out of trouble, but could also continuously expand its sphere of influence towards any target within its range. The consequence was the unconditional decapitation of the victim, and the only ones that could resist were saints. To think for the past half a month, he and his crew have been dealing with this dangerous anomaly, even though the escort journey has never been dangerous except for the final encounter with the Vanished, he still feels a little scared in retrospect. However, it was just fear on his part since that's all in the past now. As a member of the Adventurers Association and a veteran ocean explorer, his job was to work with the boundless sea. However, unlike fishermen who only operate in safe offshore areas, he has spent most of his sailing career dealing with anomalies and even visions. When undertaking an anomaly delivery job, the authorities or churches would inform the transportation crew in advance of the dangers. This part was often the shortest part of the entire commission contract, usually with only one message: this task is fatally dangerous, and the specific details cannot be divulged. Every captain who earned a living by traveling between city-states knew what he was facing, and more than half of them would eventually be entangled by this deadly career in their later years. For Captain Lawrence, many of his colleagues of the same age have retired by now, either trapped in incessant nightmares or suffering from mental problems caused by various degrees of curses. In some cases, disabilities are also included due to a long voyage or worse. Of course, equal compensation was rewarded for such a dangerous job. Unlike commoners scraping by in the city-states, captains of a ship would never have to worry about their retirement funds. Unfortunately, that's the least of a captain's worry because the occupational diseases are abundant. Captain Lawrence had no delusions of being a nobleman. He did this mainly to earn money on top of his passion for exploring the sea. But like most people, the passion of youth doesn't always earn one a healthy lifestyle, and now, he's starting to feel his enthusiasm and passion burning out. Ads by PubFuture. While my mental health is still normal, while the boundless sea hasn't yet entangled my fate yet, it's best I find time to retire. Lawrence sighed slightly, turned, and slowly walked back towards the captain's room. The priest's search and questioning of the entire ship were not over yet, and he could not abandon the White Oak until then. Afterwards, though, he and his crew would be transferred for isolation and observation, as well as a series of psychiatric tests by the authorities. His gaze eventually swept over the familiar onboard facilities around him after coming aboard. It's an excellent new ship with only 5 years of service. Honestly, Lawrence seriously felt reluctant to retire so early on, but it's either early retirement or the likelihood of spending his life in the insane asylum. In the city-state downtown, in the old antique shop, the middle-aged man lying on the bed back on the second floor had slowly come to. In his view was a moldy ceiling reflecting into Duncan's field of vision. Phew. Duncan exhaled softly, feeling the perception from this body quickly clearing up and stabilizing. After 2 to 3 seconds, he braced those arms and pushed himself up. I also flies over then, her beak chirping loudly, "Honey, welcome home. Do you want dinner first or a bath first, or perhaps?" Duncan was about to stretch his limbs when he cramped up over the last word. Without hesitation, he slapped the dove as punishment. Why in the world would you say something like that? I was obviously an extraordinary bird because she didn't get fazed in the slightest. Briskly flapping her wings and chirping loudly, "Boo, a punch for a nosebleed for a crooked nose and nosebleed for a sauce shop." Duncan didn't know if he should suffocate this dove at this point because his brain honestly couldn't keep up. Then turning to look at the table, he saw the various test items he had prepared from the Vanished: sun talisman, dagger, cheese, a cannonball, and a salted fish. Ads by PubFuture. Everything's here, and it doesn't look like I had any sort of packet loss during the transfer. This bird is more reliable than I thought. Duncan stepped forward and visually checked each item for any damages and found none. This improved his mood and even changed his annoyed look on I, who was still acting silly on the bed and spouting dumb things. Old treasonous bastard will be butchered. On guard, you sly dog. Duncan, realizing he was the dumb one for even thinking about praising the bird, he sat down on the chair and checked the goods some more with his ghost fire for an in-depth review. The first was the Sun Talisman, which has not changed, as an supernatural item that has been completely transformed and controlled by the ghost fire. It still lingered with a flicker of his power. The dagger, which did not possess supernatural attributes, did not look any different. Except for the ancient style, its blade was still sharp, and the scabbard was well maintained. Afterward, Duncan's gaze fell on the piece of cheese that had come out of the vanished's kitchen. The cheese was not acting strange or smelled rotten. It's still edible according to his judgment. Now then, it was the cannonball's turn. He was curious about this one because he knew this metal ball was one of those active items aboard the ship. Duncan tapped the iron shell and attempted to get feedback. Nothing came. November LBJNN. Ads by PubFuture. On the vanished, he knows certain objects had a mind of their own, while some are a collective hive with multiple subunits. This cannonball was part of those subunits, so his experiment here was to see if the shell could connect with the main hive back on the ship. Since there's no feedback, it could only mean the shell has become no more than a lump of metal. Duncan mused over this discovery and started expanding his idea. If I start taking back shells to the vanished, would they also be recognized as a sub-unit of the ammunition depot on the vanished? If yes, then that means I can replenish the ammunition aboard. But what criteria must I meet? I know the cannonballs I used to sink Alice's coffin didn't return, so there must be a range limit. And what about upgrading the artillery system? Cannonballs are from the last century, meaning they're likely outdated by now. Can I use more advanced shelling? Actually, if I can replenish the ammo aboard, wouldn't that mean I can also add new facilities and equipment to the vessel? For example, I might not even need to use cannons anymore and instead replace them all with something higher tech. I can also improve the living conditions aboard. Maybe a new bed or a sofa. Duncan couldn't help but salivate on the possibilities. The more he came into contact with the modern city-state of plant, the more he felt that the vanished needed to be improved upon. Glamour from a century ago doesn't mean anything in modern times. Sure, a ghost ship's weird and terrifying power would bring fear to any sailor, but it had no electric lighting, no processing chips of a computer, no missile systems, and most of all, no boiler for hot showers. Oh right, there's also no French fries aboard for I. Duncan silently glanced at the dove, who had jumped out onto the windowsill staring off into the distance. Sensing the attention, I looked back with those mung bean eyes and chirped, "Buy some fries from the dock." "Shut up. Don't mention fries." Duncan rebuffed the bird before turning his attention to the last item. The salted fish was a pure and natural processed item gifted to him by nature. It tastes good, smells good, and belongs to the items outside of the vanished. After experiencing the spirit walk, this salted fish didn't seem to change much either. Let's have Nina turn it into a stew this evening. Chapter 69 Inches City-State Life. After inspecting all the test items, Duncan now has a further understanding of the bird's transportation ability and the capacity she held. I could transport several different items simultaneously, including organic, inorganic, supernatural, and ordinary things. The type of goods would not affect the stability of her power, and the transportation process would not affect the goods' nature. The transportation ability also doesn't seem to consume much of her energy, either. Whether it was the ritual dagger at the beginning, or a bunch of things at once, the bird was still bouncing around as ever. Of course, this may be because the total amount of cargo she has transported so far was too small and didn't hit the bottleneck. Regardless, further testing was still in order regarding eyes, weight, and volume limit. Duncan summarized the currently known information one by one, and only after confirming that everything was in place did he breathe a sigh of relief. He knows that the tests done so far are still very much imperfect, and many possible variables have not been carefully considered. Moreover, even from the perspective of test subjects, the samples he selected are too small to accumulate valid data. In the future, he will select more types of different weights and volumes. Only then could he call the data reliable. Duncan was very cautious in this regard, and this caution wasn't without reason, because he has a very bold plan, or idea in mind. Since I could teleport items between land and the vanished intact without limiting what type of items they are, then, wouldn't she be able to ship people as well? Like, someone that's not so human. For example, Alice. Ads by PubFuture. Duncan knows that a single person's strength is limited. With only his ability to walk in the spirit world to link the ship with the city-states, it would just be a matter of time before he encounters a problem of insufficient manpower. However, if there's a helper around, the situation would be much better. As it so happens, I's ability has given him a lot of room to work with. Of course, Alice was not a good candidate. This numbered anomaly called 099, although elegant and mysterious when sitting quietly, was in essence a useless and cowardly doll that could hardly do anything right. Remembering that his only crew member available to him was an individual who could actually stew her own head during cooking was enough to make any man sigh in agony. The positioning of the Vanished as a world-class enemy was truly a headache. Let's say he did go out and recruit more sailors. What then? The ones that would dare apply would probably be villainous crooks themselves. You know, the type that goes pirate robbing on Monday and Wednesday, then demon sacrificing on Tuesday and Friday, and then finally guerrilla warfare with the church on weekends. But that's a plus in retrospect. At least those crooks would easily mingle with the goat head, who's constantly yapping about invading a city-state. Alice is at least honest and obedient. Duncan sighed and stood up, muttering to himself, if I properly train her, she can grow up properly too, probably. Even if she can't be a helper, it is good nevertheless to let that doll see the world. After all, it won't be good to keep her so clueless and lacking in common sense. After sorting out his thoughts, Duncan began to pack up the things he had brought with him. He would not return them to the Vanished for the time being. There aren't many places to hide things on the second floor of the antique shop, and Nina was always there to clean up his room. So having some random items around would surely be suspicious, especially when one of them was a century-old cannonball. But after a short contemplation, Duncan found some suitable places to hide them. The sun talisman could be kept on his body, the salted fish would go directly into the kitchen, and the cannonball and dagger were even easier to dispose of. Without delay, Duncan took the two most suspicious items downstairs and directly placed them in a corner next of the counter. This was an antique shop, and having more or less old relics lying around and piled up couldn't be any more normal. Well, calling this an antique shop was a compliment since almost everything on the first floor are counterfeits. As for the last one, the cheese he grabbed from the Vanished's kitchen, Duncan also found a good place for it, in the trash. After dealing with all this, Duncan patted the non-existent dust on his hands and smiled with a very satisfied grin over the arrangement. Ads by PubFuture. Then he glanced at the sky outside, where the sun, confined by the double rune ring, was hanging high in the sky. Nina would return home later today, before which he plans to go out to learn more about the city. It doesn't seem like there's any business today anyways. Since the weather was a little cool, Duncan changed into a dark brown coat and groomed his somewhat messy hair before going out. This was his way of making this old and tattered body look a bit more refreshed after being tormented by drugs and alcohol for so long. Once out and walking, Duncan didn't need to wait before the sound of flapping wings came from the second floor. It was I who flew down to land on his shoulders while pressing her head triumphantly against his, to the Erxian Bridge, then take the Chunghwa Avenue. Duncan shot a sideway glance at this bird. He had initially planned to keep the dove home to watch house. After all, when going outside, having a bird on his shoulder was too eye-catching and weird. What's more, his connection with the bird would allow him to summon the dove whenever he likes. Of course, taking her along wouldn't mean a thing, but now, I had taken the liberty of using this opening to tag along on her own accord for a car ride. Looking at the triumphant appearance of this bird, Duncan finally smiled helplessly and sighed, forget it. Follow if you like it. With this arrangement, the pair took the main road opposite to the antique shop and continued until the man overheard the crisp sound of a bell ringing. Looking over, Duncan could see a double-decker bus with a brown and blue striped paint job driving along the main tracks until it stopped next to a station not far away. It was the common form of public transport in the city-state of Planned, a vehicle powered by a steam engine. By spending a fare of 6 pesos, affordable by most lower sector citizens of the city, one could ride the bus according to the pre-planned route as long as one wished. From what Duncan could discern according to the map displayed along the pole sign up ahead, this bus route went around the city and then eventually up into the higher sector, only stopping and making a round trip at an area called the crossroad. Duncan had an image of this crossroad from the memory fragments. This neighborhood was regarded as the junction of the city, the most prosperous commerce area with decent housing arrangements. Many lower residents regarded this neighborhood as their dream goal in life, while many middle-class citizens who could not afford such an expensive upscale arrangement would also try their best to live as close as possible to that spot since it had almost everything in terms of facilities, theaters, museums, and several upscale restaurants. Ads by PubFuture. Nina's school was also near the crossroad, and the museum she mentioned wanting to visit was also located in that area. Duncan thought for a moment, then quickly walked to the station and got on before the bus started again. There was hardly anyone on the bus as he checked, only partially full with the first floor entirely devoid of passengers. However, there was the driver in his seat and the dark blue uniformed conductor standing ready to take his fare. The young woman had simple makeup and a short haircut, but that friendly smile was as genuine as it came until she noticed the dove on Duncan's shoulder. "Sorry, pets are not allowed on board. It's the rule," the young woman said uncomfortably, pointing up to the bird on Duncan's shoulder, including doves. Duncan looked at I, who flapped her wings innocently and tilted her head to look at him. "Go to the roof of the car. Coo, coo." I flapped her wings and flew out of the car, cooing, all the while in protest. The young conductor lady appeared almost speechless at this weird display of man and bird communicating together. "Is it okay now?" Duncan waved at the conductor, who seemed to be in a daze over his actions and pointed to the roof. "You shouldn't mind a bird riding on the car roof, right?" Only then did the conductor react. "Ah, yes, the fare is 6 pesos for a pass." Duncan reached into his pocket and pulled 2 coins for the blue ticket, then found a window seat and sat quietly to enjoy his first car ride in the world. November LBJNN. Accompanying the vibration and mechanical friction was the engine starting up, followed by the ringing of the bell in the front for the time of departure. The scenery gradually receded outside the window as Duncan comfortably leaned back in his seat. Steam is a good thing, civilized society is a good thing, scientific and technological progress is a good thing. If I get a chance, I must get myself a seating like this as well on the vanished. The old wooden chairs are not comfortable at all. Oh right, I mustn't forget a boiler. It's just not right doing without a hot shower. As soon as his thoughts were spreading into other areas, the guy suddenly felt a short rumble in the car as it came to a crawl, eventually to a stop. "You coming on? There are seats still." The young conductor pushed open the window near the front and shouted outside. Duncan was startled and chuckled dumbly at himself. Apparently he's still a stranger to this world because he had forgotten how lively life could be in a typical city. Chapter 70 Inches I'm one of you. How do ordinary people survive in a world with supernatural visions, where the lands are blocked by endless oceans and where anomalies and city-state are constantly engaged in endless fighting? Duncan still lacked knowledge of the world, but at least in the places he saw, the ordinary folks of this place still lived in an environment of relative stability and order. They worked, they studied, they rested, they run their own shops, they mingled, they go out on their days off, they go to the theaters and restaurants, they go to the parks and ports, they visited museums, they gossiped with their neighbors after dinner, they did everything a person would when living a not so exciting but nominally secure life. Duncan sat in his seat, curiously observing everything around him as the ordinary folks went about their daily lives. From what he perceived, they're not much different from those on Earth aside from the supernatural bits. The bus stopped again upon approaching the crossroad, and this time many passengers boarded. Duncan continued to stare curiously out the window at this location. There are plumes of steam coming out of the chimney chutes, as well as crisscrossing pipes connecting the various buildings along the streets. But suddenly, the man was alarmed when an inexplicable surge of heat rose from his chest. Glancing down, he realized it had come from the sun talisman hanging around his neck. Naturally, Duncan was stunned by this discovery. Out of reflex, he touched the spot covered by his shirt and felt the temperature with his fingers. It's not only hot but actually slightly vibrating. He didn't know what was going on, but it was clear that the talisman resonated with something nearby. Through the connection he had established with the item, he quickly locked onto a figure outside the car window speeding through the crowd. The person wore an ordinary black coat that gave no sign he was any different from the passers-by. However, Duncan's certain the talisman was pointing at him. Without hesitation, he immediately got up from his seat and marched towards the exit while sending a mental message to I. The bird immediately jumped off the bus roof and landed on the man's shoulder. Ads by PubFuture. The conductor standing near the door watched in amazement, and only after Duncan got off the bus did she mutter, "How did he train that dove?" But then this little episode of daily life quickly receded from the conductor's attention as the wave of passengers boarded the steam bus, this spot to buy tickets. Children also need to buy. Hey, this kid is taller than 1 meter. 4 years old. This can't be 4 years old. Look, he must buy a ticket if he crosses this measuring line. By now, Duncan had already marched into the crowd and entered an intersection while tracking that black coat. The suspicious individual clearly had a purpose in how swift and agile he moved through the dense collage of people. In fact, it didn't take more than a minute for Duncan to lose sight of the black coat. Thankfully, the resonance from the sun talisman remains, and the feedback from the item told the antique shop owner which direction he needed to go. Duncan thought quickly as he followed the guidance. There is no doubt that the black coat is suspicious, and this talisman must have sensed something to react so strongly. Perhaps, it perceived a homologous power from the real sun god. From the goat head, Duncan had already learned that the talisman had the function of identifying and blessing fellow citizens who followed the black sun. However, under normal circumstances, only the faithful could use this function or perceive the guiding effect of the talisman. Duncan had usurped control of the item with his ghost fire, but at the time, he thought that his flame had destroyed most of the talisman's abilities, but now it seems, the recognition ability of this thing was still there. It's just that this recognition ability was now being used at his own discretion. Guided by the talisman, he gradually left the main road crowded with passers-by and gradually walked into a deserted path after 3 turns. Here, Duncan saw the suspicious figure again. The person was speeding past the intersection ahead, seemingly oblivious to the addition of a tailing tracker behind himself. Then the talisman on his chest grew a little hotter again, and the resonance became clearer as well. Ads by PubFuture. Duncan quietly drove the ghost fire inside, reading the information from this sun talisman with his mind. It felt subtle. Even though the item had no thinking properties, Duncan could feel the excitement from the talisman conveying through himself. It's telling him where the other believers are to the point that Duncan wants to remind the thing to be more reserved. For real, not long ago, this sacred relic still belonged to a heretic of the Black Sun. It doesn't need to be so excited to rat its former creators out. At the same time, Duncan became more and more confident that he was approaching a secret meeting place where many followers had gathered. This proves his theory that the gathering in the sewer was no more than a small slice of the bigger pie. He didn't know what the cultists were trying to do now, but he did know one thing: they knew more about the ancient history of this world than Nina's history teacher. To understand the deeper secrets of this world, it was necessary to contact the forces of the transcendent realm. The authorities and church would be difficult to approach, but cultists on the other hand are much simpler to mingle with. No-vel-b, in .c ohm. If anything, he could just beat them up if they refused. It's then his train of thought came to a halt. In front of him was a dead end, and the sneaky black coat had slipped into a nearby alley. On top of this, more siblings were coming up from behind, at least that's what the talisman sensed. Duncan silently pulled up the lapels of his coat, hiding half of his face in the collar with the process. Almost the next second after the action was done, a series of footsteps could be heard from the nearby buildings. One after another, figures appeared. It was about a dozen people wearing attires no different from any common citizen. Like an assassin wouldn't walk outside in broad daylight, these cultists wouldn't hold a sign claiming to be heretics either. Nevertheless, the constant heat and directional signal from the sun talisman was all the convincing Duncan needed to confirm their identity. While he examined the group was also eyeing him warily until a young tall and thin man whispered something to his companion on the side. "This is private land. What are you sneaking around here for?" The tall and thin man spoke. He seemed to be trying to create an impression that they're all good abiding citizens, and Duncan was in fact the suspicious trespasser. Duncan murmured inside that he was really not cut out to be a spy because he didn't know what lie he should make in this situation. But then a naughty idea popped up in his head. What if he acts stupid and refuses to leave? Would these cultists attack him? Or would they pretend to be thugs and mug him? Didn't you hear me? The tall and thin man frowned and said impatiently. At the same time as his voice fell, the figures around him quietly took half a step forward, faintly forming an encirclement. I'm talking to you. Duncan shrugged his shoulders, casually touched the sun talisman from his chest, and said sincerely, I'm one of you. Let's mingle in first. Maybe I can get something out of them. No need to waste this chance.